Joining me is Rhiana Gunn-Wright from the Roosevelt Institute. Rhiana, are you there?
Yeah.
Great, wonderful. Hi, it's so nice to actually see you. We got a chance to chat the other day, but didn't get the visual, so it's very nice to have the face-to-face. I wanted to get started just with a simple definition of terms. So the
Mhm.
conversation around climate justice can seem very broad. We're talking about everything from international diplomacy and managing sea level rise to like factory siting and police violence, even. So, when you talk about climate justice, what do you mean?
So when I talk about climate justice, like when a lot of people talk about climate justice, it's about, I think, three things in particular. The first is about access to a healthy environment for everyone equally, right? We know that people of color, particularly Black, Latino, and Native populations, are far more likely to live near toxic pollution, to have not clean drinking water, to have polluted air. And it's similar in some rural communities, too, with issues with agricultural runoff. And so climate justice starts from that place that everyone should have access to the same climate that allows them to live healthy, dignified lives. The second thing I would say is an acknowledgement that climate is far broader than the way that we talk about it, which is really funny because if you think of society as a body, then energy is our food, and sort of climate is the thing that we need to survive. It's incredibly broad. But often we only talk, at least when I was growing up, mainstream environmentalism was largely about the Arctic, about conservation, about natural resources. And climate justice acknowledges that, like, our built environment is also part of our environment, and that climate means the physical conditions that you need to live a healthy and whole life. And so that means, like we said, is there lead in your home? Is there lead in your water? Do you have clean air? And also, I think something that climate justice activists have been talking about for a long time is that problems, say like police brutality, are not separate from the effects of climate change and of pollution in these communities. They're all experienced as part of the environment that in lots of ways decides if you live or die. And then the third part of climate justice is a recognition that climate isn't a technical problem. The climate crisis is not purely a matter of reducing emissions, but we have to acknowledge that the reason that we're in the climate crisis and what we see is a result of our economic and social system. So just an acknowledgement that that you know that the things that we're seeing are driven by the way that we have structured our economy and society, and thus the things that we need to do to address climate change look will likely be a lot broader and deeper than we usually talk about or acknowledge that it will be.
hmm So, you were, of course, one of the architects of the Green New Deal, and a lot of these ideas were incorporated into that document. And that was, we started talking about this more broadly as a society a couple of years ago, and it was very
Mhm.
controversial. From the perspective of today, that seems almost quaint. Like a lot of these ideas have become not quite mainstream, but at least, discussed in the mainstream. Like we saw last week, Joe Biden released not just a climate plan, but a separate incorporated climate justice plan. And so I wanted to ask you about that. How close did that come to, I guess, accomplishing what you think needs to be accomplished as far as pursuing and achieving climate justice?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Biden plans had really some really good things in them, right? There's 40% of money going to frontline communities. communities, right? 40% of those investments going into frontline communities, committing to carbon-free electricity by 2035 is another one. Setting up an office in DOJ that is specifically about environmental injustice. Those are really important interventions, especially when you're talking about things like, say, Cancer Alley, right? Communities that have been fighting legal fights for decades, in some cases for years on end, and not making any progress. So like something like an environmental justice part of DOJ could go a long way to doing that. And I think that is an example of one of the really important things about the Green New Deal, is about the Green New Deal is both about, of course, reducing emissions, but because we see the climate crisis as the effect of economic and social systems, it's also about changing power relationships, right? One of the fundamental arguments from climate justice activists, and to some extent, the Green New Deal, is an acknowledgement that, like, the ability to use fossil fuels without restrictions requires people who are seen as disposable, right? Because when you are burning fossil fuels, say at a peaker plant, right, or at a refinery, that produces a lot of pollution. And so as long as there are people who are disposable, there's always essentially a place to do that. And so when you think about the effect of power, say at the Dakota Access Pipeline, essentially that was first supposed to go through Bismarck. The residents of Bismarck got that pipeline redirected through like a series of community town hall meetings. When you think about that compared to what Native activists had to do at Standing Rock, you see what it means, what power means, and what is possible when communities have power. Same thing in Cancer Alley, like I talked about. The one community that did get addressed was a white community, right? Again, we're talking about issues of power. And so any plan has to not just reduce emissions, but truly think about how are we empowering people of color, right? How are we empowering and creating opportunities to build power for wealth, for ownership, for political power in communities that have been marginalized? Because when you think about it, that is one of our best buffers um, against further degradation of our environment. And so that is really crucial, that ability to move power. And that is a matter of top line policies like 40% to frontline communities, but it's also a matter of downstream effects, right? Will people's taxes go up when they upgrade their homes? I know a story, at least one story of a community group, right, that remediated someone's home. She almost lost it because her taxes went up because her home value went up, right? Can the right small community organizations, can they compete for federal grants, right? If we're providing money through federal grants, when people are getting resettled, how are we dealing with the impact of redlining on the value of their home? How will they move if their home is so devalued that they can't buy a home in another place, right? And they have to retreat from the place where they're living. So all of that is involved, I think, in good climate policy. So I think the Biden plan is a step, and I'm sure they're probably thinking about some other things as well. But I think ultimately the Green New Deal was about addressing the climate crisis in a particular way, which is a way that both um, creates millions of good jobs, right? That redresses environmental injustice, but all with a goal of righting power relationships from the sort of extreme distribution that we have right now.
So a lot of that, when we talk about plans that are comprehensive and systemic, a lot of times the conversation sort of runs aground on this notion of political will. Like, we can't get this done, it's too big. How will we ever get everyone to agree on all these policies at the same time? You talked a little bit about this in an interview with the MIT Technology Review last month, and I just want to, read you everybody a quote from that. You said people were nervous that attaching climate change and climate policy to calls for racial justice or economic justice was too much, that we were actually going to make it harder to make promise on climate, as if they aren't all connected, which they are. And so we've seen, in the first issue of the Green magazine, we did a lot of, reporting and writing about green stimulus, and even talking to some climate activists, climate advocates. We heard some of this same attitude about uh, stimulus funding for green projects. Like, we don't want to do it all at once. It would be, it would be crass. Like, let's attack the health side of this problem first, and then move on to climate. But that seems to be sort of anathema to the ideas that are embodied in the Green New Deal and the idea of climate justice.
Yeah, I mean, they are anathema. I actually experienced this in my own work. There were a lot of conversations I was involved in around COVID stimulus. It was like, should we mention climate? Should we push for climate protections in this bill? And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's insensitive. And I always thought that was very interesting because if you pause and think about it, what folks are really saying in that is, besides we want to respect, right, the immense loss that's happening, and not seem as though we're trying to use this as a political opportunity when hundreds, over at this point 150,000 people have died. That is a huge loss, and we have to sit with that and allow space for people to grieve. And I understood that, but there was also an element of that I felt that was unspoken, which was that we are still thinking of climate and environment as a white issue, right? Because especially in the context of the uprisings, I heard the same thing. We can't bring climate in here, which was really interesting because essentially you're saying we want to center Black voices in a Black struggle, and climate is too white to bring into that conversation, which is, anathema to what Black activists, both around police brutality and around climate, have been talking about. And that's because, one, a lot of times those are the same activists, because, like I said, police brutality and toxic pollution exists in the same communities. I'm from a community that's likely a frontline community. And, one of the things that I was experienced, I got asthma because of elevated pollution around my home, but I was also incredibly terrified of police my whole life, right? That's not different. Those things aren't different. And in fact, if we're actually listening to people of color, including Movement for Black Lives, and the NAACP, people who have direct, the NAACP has a climate justice and environmental justice program for a reason. And so I think that we just have to sit with that and recognize, like, why do we think that this isn't the right thing to bring into this moment? And then the second thing is that, yeah, I think a lot of times um, on even the level of the problems that we're facing, that also doesn't make sense because COVID happened, one, partially as a result of some of the economic systems that drive climate change, right? There's some thoughts about the way factory farming allows viruses like this um, to sort of change themselves more frequently, and we're having more outbreaks. So that's part of it, but it's also happening in the context of ongoing environmental injustice and climate change. So thinking about right now, right, toxic pollution, we know, is one of the reasons that Black people are dying at double the rates from COVID, right? There's already a study showing that correlation. And when it first happened, you can basically map frontline communities with COVID hotspots. And so this idea that these things are happening in two separate vacuums isn't true. At the same time as, like, one of the reasons that we couldn't manage COVID, and possibly that rates were so high in those communities, where people were too poor to stop going to work when they needed to stop going to work, right? So all of these things are happening at the same time, and trying to act as though they aren't happening at the same time, both doesn't allow us to attack the problems and the sort of system that is the systems that are creating the problems effectively. um, it hinders us from doing that. um, and I think the other really interesting thing about that is, Well, like the last speaker said, the cost of doing nothing about climate, of destabilizing our climate, is astronomical, right? We literally don't know and cannot comprehend all of what is going to happen. And so this idea that politics, like we have to live in the political reality, actually sort of misplaces um, where we what we actually have control over. We have control over our system, over our institutions, right? We have control over our politics. That's the thing we have the most control over. We don't have control over climate systems. We don't have control over the emissions that we have already released that are already affecting us. And so to say that our politics is the thing that sort of is most in the way, I just have a hard time thinking that. I mean, the Earth is 5-0 in the extinction game. She has never lost, right? So to think that it is easier to somehow figure out how to suck carbon out of the air, or right to deal with this in ways that don't require any sort of change in our political system, or largely allow us to keep doing business as usual, I think is a deep misunderstanding of what what we can do and what we can't do, and what we need, what we actually have the most control over to lead us to good climate policy, and what we don't have control over, which is managing all of the fallout that will come if we don't actually do what is necessary to reduce emissions and to decrease temperature rise within the time frame that we have.
Hmm. So we have a question from the audience about how capital could best be directed within urban communities to address climate priorities. I know we talked about, the Biden proposal, which proposes to direct 40% of that funding to urban communities. But what sort of projects should we be expecting? Should we be looking for?
Well, I mean, the projects that I think will people will see most in urban communities out of the Biden plan, there's a lot of investment in buildings, energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings. I think you're going to see a lot of work around solar installations, residential solar. I think you're going to see a lot of some impacts with electric vehicles, and there could be some changes in the ways that we sort of measure and deal with environmental justice. As far as what capital can do, I think that's an interesting question, because there is an issue with like mismatch of capital. A lot of the groups that can do the most innovative work cannot take in the amount of capital that most people want to move, right? So there's some efforts to essentially, out of a couple of nonprofits in California, to figure out a way to harmonize that, to make it possible for community orgs to take in large amounts of capital to do projects, particularly around buildings. But I think in the absence of that, thinking about the ways, one, that folks can support and work directly with environmental justice organizations and climate justice organizations, particularly ones that are already doing things like retrofitting buildings, teaching people how to weatherize homes, installing solar. There's like Push Buffalo in New York, and Buffalo, New York does some of that. So there are opportunities for that. But then the other thing that I think is thinking about some of the sort of downstream aspects, say like higher taxes if people do retrofits. I think an interesting model that some people are talking about in Buffalo is actually moving corporate money to, while these gaps exist, to fund things like, hey, if you improve your home, we'll handle the tax increase. There's a fund to handle the tax increase, right? There's a fund to
Mhm.
handle those sorts of solutions that directly support people to do the things that we know we need to do to reduce emissions, while also giving them the direct support while the gaps in the overall sort of systems exist.
Mhm. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to ask, when we talk about climate change, we talk about the systemic improvements needed to address climate change. I'm wondering whether you see a path to a carbon neutral society, one that is no longer causing these major catastrophic changes, that doesn't also lead to a more just society. Like, is there a way to still screw this up?
Yes, certainly. there's no
Immense
there's
capacity
no
to screw this up.
there's immense opportunities to screw this up. Well, I would say two things. I think not. I think it would have been more possible before we were in the place that we are today, which is where we just need sort of rapid and massive investments and rapid and massive change, right? I do think there was a scenario when, say, you could have done this largely and not well, I think, but you could have reduced emissions at least, period, through, say, some more technical mechanisms like a carbon tax. But one, we don't have the runway for that to and have those things. Not that a carbon tax doesn't have a place, but those things alone, we're sort of, that's not really, I think, real to reduce emissions at the scale and as quickly as we need to. And then I think the second thing is it's not really a political reality anymore. Um, I think one, um, because it's such a polarized issue. And I think what we saw with police reform and the uprisings is that it's really important if you're going to move something that has no support on one side, you need big multiracial coalitions that can build power, that can put power in the streets. And that is very difficult to do if you are not talking about climate in a way that also creates a more just and whole society, because we talk a lot about parts per million, et cetera, but the way that most people, particularly, yeah, most people, period, experience climate change is economic and health loss, right? Those impacts. Will I
Mm-hmm.
lose my home? Will I lose my job? Right? Will Am I getting sick from this, right? Am I getting sick from these pollutants? What's going to happen? And the fact is that you can't, I just think it's human nature, you cannot get someone to take a loss if you cannot either show how you'll replace the thing that they will lose, which in some cases is impossible, right? We also have to grasp that, like, climate crisis is here, there is some amount of loss that we just can't avoid. It's
Mm-hmm.
too, and we have to accept that. And so if you can't replace the thing, you have to be able to tell people, okay, you're going to experience a loss, but here's how I'm going to change the conditions so that that loss creates as little harm as possible. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, other than that, you're going to have a very difficult time selling people on something that feels to them so far away, so slow moving,
Right.
um, and that that people are really thinking about in terms of, they know this is going to change their world. They know going off fossil fuels will. So if we can't tell them and really create a plan for how we're going to make that transition and also hold and protect people the best that we can, then I don't know how you really have these conversations, particularly when you have a political party that's not sure it's a problem, and you also have companies with large amounts of money that are invested in not necessarily changing this on the
Mm-hmm.
scale or in the ways that we want.
Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately, but thank you so much for joining us.